My name is Christopher Seeley, Program Director for School and Justice Initiatives for the APA Foundation, and I will be your moderator for this event. Tonight, we want to focus on why students display disruptive behaviors. Essentially, what is the root cause to this behavior? How parents, school staff, and community members can respond with compassion and empathy in these moments, how schools can begin to address the school-to-prison pipeline, looking at the need for support services in schools versus punishment. A little housekeeping before we begin. To ask our panel a question, please utilize the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question for a particular panelist, please indicate that within your question. We may not be able to get to your specific question, but we will try our best to answer as many questions as possible. We are recording this event, so if you happen to lose your connection or run into any technical difficulties, do not worry. We will archive this information on the APA website. It is now my honor to introduce to you our panelists. First, Dr. Anish Dubey. Dr. Dubey is a psychiatrist on staff for the County of Orange in California, treating young people involved in the justice and foster care system and clinical supervision for child and adolescent psychiatrist fellows for the University of California, Irvine. He is also a member of the American Psychiatric Association Council on Children, Adolescents, and Their Families, and is an advisor for the American Psychiatric Association Foundation. Thank you, Dr. Dubey, for joining us here tonight. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sarah Vincent. Dr. Vincent is a triple board certified child and adolescent, adult, and forensic psychiatrist. She is the founder and principal consultant of Lorio Forensics, a multidisciplinary forensic mental health expert consultation company grounded in relevant clinical experience and cultural and structural competency. She has provided direct patient care in juvenile and adult correctional facilities and served as a forensic mental health expert in family, civil, criminal, state, and federal courts. She's an associate professor of psychiatry and pediatrics at Morehouse School of Medicine and holds an adjunct faculty appointment at Emory School of Medicine. Dr. Vincent is a co-chair for the Foundation's Judges and Psychiatrists Leadership Initiative. Thank you so much, Dr. Vincent, for joining us here tonight. Next, I'd like to introduce to you Professor Randy Waldman. Professor Waldman is the director of the Barton Juvenile Defender Clinic at Emory University School of Law. In this role, she supervises law students in holistic representation of young people charged with delinquent offenses. In addition to representing these clients in their juvenile court cases, she and her students also represent them in special education proceedings, school suspension proceedings, and other forms according to the client's needs. Professor Waldman also engages in policy work related to juvenile justice issues and teaches courses in juvenile justice and education law. Professor Waldman is the co-director of the Southern Juvenile Defender Center and serves as the treasurer for the executive committee of the Child Protection and Advocacy section of the State Bar of Georgia, and on the advisory board for Partners for Equity in Child and Adolescent Health. Thank you so much, Professor Waldman, for joining us here tonight. Welcome all of our attendees to this very important conversation. Thank you all for taking some time to spend with us tonight in what is a very sometimes difficult but very important conversation to have. And I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us here tonight as well and taking time out of their busy schedules. First, I'd like to send it over to Dr. Dubey. And Dr. Dubey, I'm just wondering if you could get us started tonight on what messages about adolescent development, mental health, and trauma emerge through disruptive behaviors.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And thank you to the Foundation and to the audience members for being here today. So when we're talking about disruptive behaviors, one of the useful analogies that I've used and I've encountered has been something similar to fever. Now, when you're talking about a fever is the body's response to an underlying condition. So fever tends to be a symptom. When we're thinking of disruptive behaviors, it's also similar in that way, that it's a psychological response for the young person to something else that's going on. Now, whether that is in response to a psychiatric condition, whether that's in response to adversity, whether that's in response to anything else, like such as trauma. So there are a number of different reasons that they might be engaging in these disruptive behaviors. And it's not necessarily that they know or that they're conscious of what they're doing. It can also be at an unconscious level. But I find it useful to usually think of it in that way, when you're thinking of it as a symptom rather than as something that they're willfully engaging in. As far as adolescence, we're learning more and more about adolescent brain development. And as we're learning about it, we're also learning that the period of adolescence, it's increasing. So this is both a challenge because it's a period of immense vulnerability, but it's also a period of opportunity. So when we're thinking about the adolescent brain development and what are the risks associated with it, especially with regards to like disruptive behaviors, what you want to think about is that adolescent their emotional brain centers develop faster, but the regulatory control centers, the centers that control the emotions, those haven't developed as fast. Those develop later. And so there's this mismatch that you have, and it can result in more impulsive and more disruptive behaviors. And on top of that, they're also much more vulnerable to peer influence, which is not the case when you're younger or when you're older. So you have this combination of vulnerability that sometimes can lead to added disruptive behaviors.
I think that analogy that you just provided with the fever is really helpful, Dr. Dubé. Thinking about, a fever could be a sign or a symptom of a lot of different medical things going on with you. And that's the same way we want to think about these disruptive behaviors, is that they're just a sign or a symptom of something else that's going on. And that the purpose for them is to either seek help. And I think also your point is that sometimes they don't even know that they're doing that for that reason as well. I think is extremely helpful. Dr. Vincent, I'm wondering if you can join into this conversation and provide us maybe with an idea of how do we support school staff in really recognizing this child or this youth, this student who are showing this disruptive behavior as needing that support rather than the punishment that they are more likely to find nowadays.
Always helps to unmute yourself. So in terms of school staff, that education component is really important. So those things that Dr. Dubé talked about are things that some school staff are aware of and that some are not. But that is, I think, step one in helping people be more understanding of why their students are doing what they're doing. The other thing that I think could be useful is helping school staff understand trauma and understand the communities that their students are coming from and the challenges that those communities face. And sometimes they know this in a sort of less defined way, but really having conversations about the things that their students are up against and how that could lead to some of the things that can seem disruptive or disrespectful or oppositional in the classroom and what those could really indicate.
Thank you. I'm wondering, Dr. Vincent, if you want to stay on just for a little bit longer, just to expand a little bit about, I think, understanding the context or the environment or where that student is coming from, almost meeting them where they're at and who they are, understanding their identity, their lived experience. What can staff members do to learn more about that student, whether that's either through that student or maybe other means?
And it may be through that student, it may be from a parent or a caregiver. But when it comes to sort of structural traumas or community level things, it's a matter of being aware of what's going on in environments. Certainly this summer, the issue of racial trauma is one that has been front and center for the rest of society in a way that it hadn't before, perhaps, or at least not in recent memory. But if you're serving a population of students who are affected by things like that, it's important for the school staff to be aware of those things and how that could be impacting how students are doing. We have studies that show us after you have a highly publicized police killing of an unarmed Black person, that adults that are Black are more likely to miss days from work because it's difficult to manage that because it is traumatic. And so our children are traumatized too. And so being aware of these things that are happening in the broader society and in the communities that kids come from does take some effort on the part of teachers who may live in different communities or who may not have that same lived experience. But it's really important for putting behaviors and perhaps even children's responses in context. When you see people in positions of authority that harm people who look like you, or when your experience of life is that people who are entrusted with your care didn't actually care for you, whether that may be the biological parent you're no longer with or the child protective services system, there's a way that positions of authority or people in authority can be viewed as not trustworthy. And it makes perfect sense based on that child's experience.
I think that's so important, right? To understand everything, the kind of the ecosystem that is completely impacting the student. You know, it's not just that individual and what they're going through. It's all of these societal things that can impact them and that can produce trauma. And we want to be able to recognize that when that disruptive behavior comes up, that's an opportunity for us to notice that. Students suspended or expelled for discretionary violations are 3 times more likely to be in contact with the juvenile justice system the following year. Professor Waldman, I'm wondering if you can jump in, and given that statistic, what does work to help the students stay in school, get connected to support, and realize the impact of the choices that they make?
Yeah, so what a lot of people don't realize is that every day you remove a child from their classroom, you're creating a break between their learning environment and success in school. So the data shows that with as few as 7 days absent from school in any given year, and those could be medically excused absences, doctor's notes, court appearances, or suspensions and expulsions, you're decreasing the odds that that child will graduate from school. And so what we need to do is keep kids connected, keep kids in school, keep kids learning. Every day they're missing school, they're missing the work, which makes it harder to catch on, harder to catch up, and falls further and further behind. And that lack of connectedness is what actually leads to further disengagement from the school environment and therefore engagement within our court system. Keeping kids connected to school can be as simple as restorative justice programs within our school program instead of referrals to court, instead of suspensions. Restorative justice is a big fancy word for saying, let's fix the harm that's been done to our community. And that can be done in any number of ways, right? When there is a miscommunication between a student and a staff member, whether that be a teacher or a principal or an assistant principal or the lunch person, right? You can resolve that miscommunication one of 2 ways. You can say, hey, student, you were wrong, and suspend or expel them. Or you can have a cooling off period followed by a dialogue, right? Why is it that the behavior the student engaged in was inappropriate for that moment? And how could they have responded differently the next time, right? When you have that conversation, the student learns from the behavior. You don't have that conversation while they're heated, while they're mad, while they're still in that heightened level of, right, in the moment, because that's what leads to the actual school-based offenses, right? That's what leads to we get arrested in school. But you let the cooling off period, and then you figure out what you can do to restore that connection to the school-based community.
You know, I think the simple fact that we don't allow students that cool off period, I think, is crucial. You know, the thing that popped into my mind as soon as you said that was, you know, I get angry with a coworker or somebody that I work with, and I write an angry email, and I have to pause and stop and kind of go, okay, like, how do I kind of approach this in a more okay, can I return this in a couple of hours and see if I'm still in that same emotional mindset, or how does that even shift the way that I'm approaching or thinking about the situation? And, we allow ourselves those moments to cool down, or we expect ourselves to do that. And we don't give that opportunity for students sometimes. And I think that's a real missed opportunity.
Many of the arrests that we see coming out of school arise from just that scenario. You have a student who's mad, who wishes to cool off, who wishes to leave their classroom. They're told they can't leave their classroom at that moment. So they get up and they leave their classroom anyway. And then instead of letting them leave and go to a counselor's office or go to a trusted adult's office, which is usually where they're trying to go, that adult generally starts following them. And then they stand in front of them. And then the student pushes past them on their way down the hallway. And then we have either a battery or an assault, depending upon your state, for touching a teacher, right? Whereas the student was just trying to disengage from a situation. We need to let that disengagement, right? Dr. Dubé and Dr. Vincent talked about, right? There's a reason why they're heated, right? It might be a PTSD reaction to something that happened. It might be that they're having a bad day because something bad happened in their home before they left to come to school that day. It might have nothing to do with anything that's happening in that school building at all. But when they tell you they need to disengage, we need to give them the out to let them disengage, because otherwise behaviors will continue to escalate because they don't have the control to regulate themselves in that moment.
And I think that practice is something that we can also encourage to bring into the home as well. I know working with juveniles and with youth, that was always something that I talked with the parents about is giving space and allowing, in that heated moment to allow the youth to walk away and have a 30-minute cool down period. And if you can't talk about it that night, then first thing tomorrow morning, let's have a conversation about it, right? Giving that space and allowing that cool down period, and allowing yourself, I think, as the adult to really take that position of not necessarily authority, but compassion, and say, I don't really know what's going on. I need to not allow my emotions to dictate what's going on in this moment. I need to allow both of us to cool down and come back and revisit this. I think, we have to make it clear, at any point in time, we cannot force anyone to engage in support services, whether that's mental health or housing or food assistance. We simply can provide that compassion and empathetic response to whatever might be going on, and connect them to that support, and walking them to that door. Given that, Dr. Dubé, I'm wondering what can we do if a youth who is displaying disruptive behavior refuses that support? Oh,
Sorry. So this is something that, as child and adolescent mental health professionals, we're commonly faced with. This is, and not just with disruptive behaviors, but oftentimes when a young person is coming to see us, it's not because they're coming to see us on their own or by their own volition, but it's because someone else has identified them as a problem, or someone else has identified that they have a problem. So one of the first things to do is to try to understand where they're coming from, and trying to understand what they view. Do they even view that there is a problem? Do they view as something else going on? So it's to understand their point of view, and by extension to understand how come they're refusing care. That would be the first step. Now, it takes a team approach. And so I think this is where it's not just the young person involved, but it also involves the rest of us, that are involved in this person's life, their clinical team, their family, the school system, everybody who's involved, the legal system, to be somewhat flexible and to be able to adapt in ways to help this person. Now, as Professor Waldman and Dr. Vincent talked about too, is that oftentimes we have these expectations of them, or we might be overwhelming them with services, even though we have good intentions and we think that this might help them. We might actually be overwhelming them with the services. I've had kids tell me, they've declined they would rather stay in juvenile hall and serve out their sentence than engage in programs outside, because they'd have to take the bus all the way across the town, and it could take 45 minutes to get to where they want to be. So these kinds of barriers to accessing care, or if there are other ways that they feel like treatment might be helpful. It's to engage them, and it's to be respectful and to understand what they think is going to be helping them. Now, finally, there are other things that if you feel like there are people in this person's life that you can use as points of leverage, that they have a more trusting relationship with, it's to use them, and it's to have them be involved in the treatment planning and in the treatment team. It's, to an extent, you're going to have adolescents, part of adolescent behavior is to be limit testing, and they do respond to structure. It's one of the things, sadly, it's one of the reasons why I see so many of the young people that I treat in juvenile hall do phenomenal in juvenile hall. And then as soon as they leave, they get in trouble again. It's part of it's because of the structure that they get here. It's okay to be authoritative. What usually doesn't help is when you're authoritarian. And so to provide that structure for young folks, to get their input, to see what's going to help them, that oftentimes will help them. Now, you might encounter somebody who is still with all those things, and as part of their development, as part of their identity building, they may decline and they might still not see it. Or even if they do, they may not seek your help. They might decline help. And sometimes that's going to be the reality. What I think would be appropriate in those situations is that, again, we remain open to them. You have a flexible attitude, is that I understand that this might not be the right time, but I'm going to be there on a consistent basis. Even if that means that not necessarily engaging in a specific type of treatment, but I just want you to come for your appointments at whatever fixed intervals that you can mutually agree upon. So it's trying to be flexible with those kinds of things and trying to engage them and letting them know that they can always come back, even if they decline care right now.
Yeah, I think you hit on so many really good points there, and I wanted to emphasize on a couple of them. I think first is just kind of being open to returning to them, right? I think part of that sometimes is just offering to check in or offering to stop by in a couple days to see how you're doing, and not taking that personal if they don't want to talk to you. Some things that we kind of joke about when we're out training schools around kind of mental health recognition is that sometimes you're going to have to walk a student 15,000 times to the support door, and you're never going to really get to see them walk through it and really engage in those support services. But really it's your role as a community member, as a person who cares about these students, to walk them to that door that many times, to provide that open door of support and services. You also talked about structure, and I think I always smile a little bit when I share, I think students, youth crave structure. They crave it. And I think what you said was so key. They want to be told a potential of how they can do things, and they want some structure, but they also want some control over that, and they want some choice. And I think we can always try to provide that. We did get a really good question kind of following up on the earlier conversation on kind of giving students space. And I wanted to see if any of the panelists were willing to kind of jump in and answer this question. But how do we help educators and administrators recognize the student is asking for space when the student is too distraught to verbalize that?
I guess since I made the comment, I'll do my best to attempt to jump in, but feel free, doctors, to provide the mental health perspective. Most of the time, in the cases that I see, the students were pretty clear that they were asking for space in one way or another, right? Sometimes they've literally said, let me go to my counselor's office, or let me go somewhere, and that's been denied. Sometimes it's as simple as putting their head down, where they're disengaging from school, and instead of checking and saying, hey, are you okay? Take 5 minutes, come back to us when you're ready. The teacher will get on them, right? Come, like, check in, do your work, the assignment's now, you have to go now, which then causes additional moments where that student just then gets more and more and more agitated, or a couple of minutes of withdrawal. It might be putting a hoodie up over their head. It might be putting a headphone in, right? Again, these are things you generally don't want to happen in the classroom, which is why, right, teachers try and take control of the situation. but sometimes that student needs those minutes. It's very rare that you're going to find a student who's that agitated who is not given some warning sign of some sort. And I'll let the mental health professionals kick in here.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything that Randy said. This is something that you don't need to be a mental health professional to know, but Professor Waldman's credit, she has seen these issues and dealt with these issues. So there's a wealth of knowledge that she has around how this shows up. But I think, it can start with putting yourself in that student's shoes. So if you're embarrassed in class, if you've been rejected in some way, if you're frustrated academically, if you know this is a child who struggles with assignments and things like that, taking a moment to think about why that student may be reacting in that way based on what has immediately preceded that in class, or what you know about that student from an academic perspective or a home life perspective.
Thank you, Professor Waldman and Dr. Vincent. Actually, Professor Waldman, we had a question specifically for you around, I guess this has started a large conversation. I think this giving students space is, I think it's what we want to do, and I think people want to engage in this conversation. So this is actually specific to a detention facility, and thinking about if a student or a young person is not given the space they request in that detention facility, and maybe they do push through or kind of incur maybe a secondary charge of assault or an additional charge, is there any kind of research or case law that could help in that kind of situation to help kind of advocate that they were kind of showing this sign of trauma or just trying to flight or freeze kind of situation?
Case law, unfortunately, is a little bit less helpful here than common sense advocacy on behalf of their defense attorney and engaging in the realistic conversation with prosecutors in those situations. I actually see fewer charges emanating from detention centers, at least in my practice and the folks I know and talk to. The detention centers generally have their own internal discipline system, DR, disciplinary referral, or significant incident referral, whatever it's called in your own community, where for some of the minor stuff, if nobody is actually injured, they'll oftentimes handle those internally, removing privileges inside the facility. I find this to be a much bigger situation inside the school setting than I do inside the detention center setting. And one of the worst things you could possibly do as a young person in the eyes of our courts is put your hands on a teacher, staff member, or school official in any way. Those cases are not treated well. They are not treated kindly. One of my defense strategies as I work through those, usually these are students who have either an IEP or a 504. So if it's been found to be a manifestation of their disability, that will go a little bit further in the court sitting, but not all the way. They are allowed to be allowed to be arrested, prosecuted, charged, right, adjudicated for things that are a manifestation of their disability. But if you have a functioning juvenile court system with functioning prosecutors, judges who are exercising discretion appropriately, you can also often identify that those issues are being dealt with in the school, the reasons why they emerged, and that they are being dealt with in the community and the home, and work through that. But as a matter of law, there's not a lot of really good law that says you get to push somebody if you're having a bad day, right? You will probably lose that trial.
Thank you so much, Professor Waldman. And I think offering maybe a little bit more of common sense practices, especially in juvenile detention facilities, but I also think schools, if you find yourself in that situation where you as a staff member, as a person who is engaging with a student who is getting upset or is upset with you, sometimes tagging out, allowing another staff member to kind of take over the situation can do a lot of good. I've seen that work wonders, especially in detention facilities. Having maybe a calmer voice come in. I've even been in kind of a group therapy session, said something, a youth responded, I smiled, and that set them off. And I was the target of it, and I had to tag out and allow somebody else kind of to come in and hold that situation. So sometimes it's about removing yourself as the staff member. Sometimes can help alleviate that as well. We're getting some really good questions in from the Q&A, so I want to encourage people to continue to use that. We did have kind of a question around if anybody could offer up some strategies to engage a young person who is agitated and angry in the school setting. So, if any of the panelists could provide some suggestions on that.
Sure. So one of the first things I would say is don't try to come up with the plan in the heat of the moment when the student is agitated and angry, because odds are there are other people in the room, including possibly the adults that are agitated and angry at that time too, and nobody does their best problem solving or planning when they're in that state. So being proactive and coming up ahead of time with what makes sense for that student, whether it is going to the school nurse or a counselor or a coach they have a good relationship with, whether it's going to the bathroom and just being allowed to leave for a few minutes, or to put their headphones on, or to put their head on their desk without being disturbed, that you plan for these things before it is an urgent need. And then that everyone at school, all of the teachers are aware of what that plan is, because something that I see happen in my practice is they'll have this plan, but everybody doesn't know the plan. And so the adults may not respect it. And then that becomes another reason for the student to get upset, because they've been bait and switch. They've been told you can do this, but now they're getting in trouble for doing it. So having a plan, disseminating the plan to all the adults involved with that student, and then following it consistently can be really helpful.
You actually, you're kind of touching on a question, Dr. Vincent, if you could stay on just for a little bit longer here. If a student is already connected to support services, say a mental health professional, they're already working with you, for example, how much does the school officials or the school even take that into account? Are you involved when disruptive behaviors come up, or how involved are mental health professionals with the school staff if they're already connected?
So it really does vary based on the school. Some schools are more receptive to our ideas and our letters and what we think than others, quite frankly. But certainly you can use that mental health professional as a resource in problem solving about what may be helpful for that student. And obviously they can't necessarily be there in real time, but when it comes to behavior plans or understanding what's going to be adaptive or positive for that student, and how that may be different based on their diagnosis or their family background or personal background. Those are things that the mental health professionals who are treating them absolutely can be helpful in helping you sort out.
Professor Waldman, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so students who have a diagnosed mental health disability are most likely going to be eligible for either Section 504 services or IDEA, special education services. To the extent that there are mental health professionals who are truly engaged in working with this young person, particularly therapists and counselors, but psychiatrists as well, your information, I do IEP meetings and 504 plan meetings all of the time. The more information we have, the better we are, right? The creation of the plan that Dr. Vincent talked about, which is how do you get a student to identify when their struggles are, when they're disengaged, when they need a help break. That plan happens at those meetings. And if we have the information from a therapist or a counselor, identifying what it is you're working on in therapy and counseling and how we can actually work together, that is essential to a good relationship with a school and a family and a student to success. right? If we could get a moment where the counselor shows up at that IEP meeting or 504 plan meeting to actually offer strategies. I sit in these meetings every day, and I'm a lawyer, right? I went to lawyer school. I didn't go to mental health, psychiatry, behavioral therapy school, and I make stuff up all the time based upon my years of experience. But I don't actually, right? I didn't train for this, right? You guys train for this. To the extent that we can get folks in the room who are working outside to work hand in hand with the folks inside, that is essential. Yes, we will read your letters. Yes, we would welcome your input. If you can write a plan for us, help us write a plan, all of that would be essential.
I think collaboration. I think that's, we see that in a lot of different areas in our community, is that the more that we can communicate about those who need additional support and services, and the more that we can really collaborate to make sure that we're not missing a gap or an opportunity to connect them to further resources or help them in whatever they need. I think that's where those conversations really come into play. I wanted to share some more statistics with everyone tonight. 14 million students are in school that have a police officer and not one of the following on staff: a counselor, a nurse, psychologist, or social worker. I think that is a pretty significant number, especially given a recent research study that Dr. Vincent and Professor Waldman recently published in The Lancet. In the pandemic paused the U.S. school-to-prison pipeline. You referenced a 27% reduction in adolescent detention population across 33 states. I'm wondering if Dr. Vincent, you wanted to jump on to maybe start us in talking about a little bit about what you found in looking at that.
Sure. So Professor Waldman can speak more to those numbers and how they may have changed since we wrote that. But I think one of the big things to keep in mind is that students are going to be coming back to school at some point. Who knows how long they'll stay when they come back, but they'll be coming back. And they will have dealt with the trauma of a pandemic. If they're students of color, they may have dealt with racial trauma as well. We know that food insecurity has been a bigger issue since people have been at home. And we also know that home school or virtual school was not school at all for a large proportion of students. And those same students who are at risk for food insecurity, not being able to have the resources, whether that's material or personal, to make use of online school offerings, are the ones that are disproportionately funneled into the school-to-prison pipeline. And so we are going to have a perfect storm of sorts when students go back to school. And there's going to need to be resources in place for them. And if the only resource is a school resource officer who is functionally a law enforcement officer at school, that will be the resource that is used. And the response that they're going to have, given their training, their orientation, their place in the justice system or the juvenile justice system, is going to be to use what they have. They're not going to do trauma-informed CBT or things like that with children. That's not their skill set. And so what we could see is that this decrease that we've seen with justice involvement of youth, with them being out of school resource officers' reach, could actually be undone when everybody goes back to school if we're not really intentional about putting other resources in place, and also understanding that they're probably going to need even more than they did before COVID occurred.
I guess I'll go backwards to the first half of the question, which is the statistics. Two phenomenon happened pretty much simultaneously when COVID started last March, or COVID shut things down last March. Number one, all of our school children were removed from schoolhouses pretty much simultaneously on March 13th, March 14th. Schools just shut down. At the same time, school courts, right, we're trying to release people from our detention centers with fear of health risks, right, in institutionalized settings. Those, right, untangling the numbers and untangling the decrease in our detention numbers from our decrease in school-based referrals is probably going to take a lot longer, right? That data is still being worked out and worked on. But what we do know is in many jurisdictions, somewhere around 40% of our school-based referrals, or 40% of our court referrals are coming from our schools. What we also know is that when those referrals stopped, right, they were just flat out done, right? There were 0 school-based referrals from March at least until May, everywhere across the country. What we know is that crime didn't correspondingly spike, right? Again, we have to untangle why, we have to untangle how, but the logical conclusion, right? The conclusion that Dr. Vincent and I drew, and that many of us are drawing across the country, is that the students who are being funneled into our juvenile justice system from school are not the people we are concerned about with respect to safety, are not the people who are committing crimes inside of our communities, and are not necessarily the people who need to be in our juvenile justice system, right? We don't need to handle them through court. They are not people who we would generally think of as criminals, right? They are people who are engaging in normal adolescent behavior inside a school setting that they are being punished for disproportionately because of where they go to school and the color of their skin. And if we can analyze that and stop for a moment and realize that these people don't need supervision, right? These young people don't need the court to be involved in their lives for them to be okay. We can address that differently, right? We can address that in school-based programming, in the restorative justice programming I discussed earlier. We can keep the school-based infractions back where they were 50 years ago inside the schoolhouse and address them there without involving the court system at all, without making communities less safe.
Thank you, Dr. Vincent and Professor Waldman. I think that's a lot for us to continue to think about and continue to look at. And I think for schools to start to really think about the support services that we can build up around students, especially given the impact of the current pandemic and what we will eventually be dealing with when students do, to Dr. Vincent's point, do come back to school. And if the only resource is that school resource officer, that's the resource they're going to get. And we know that's not what they need, which is really important. Dr. Dubé, I'm wondering if you could jump in. We got a question around kind of the school, the mental health professional, working with the parents, and sometimes that's successful, sometimes that isn't. Can you share maybe strategies to engage the parent in addressing that disruptive behavior?
Yeah, so one of the things, when we're talking about child and adolescent psychiatry, a lot of times we refer to it as child and family psychiatry because we're dealing with the entire family. Young folks are embedded within systems, and the primary system that they're embedded in is the family. So oftentimes it is making family interventions, it is treating the entire family. And one of the things that I'm pretty fond of when I first meet somebody, and when I have parents come in with their young folks, is to let them know that we're not here to pathologize any individual, but we recognize that there are relationships and that there are different points in the relationships that have become dysfunctional or that have become pathological. And so you try to de-emphasize pathology in any one individual. And does it mean that you're treating an individual? Sure. But it also means that you're treating the entire system. It also means that you're going to be looking at interventions both on the family side and both, if you can, interventions at school, and then on the interventions at the individual level. As far as parents, one of the things that oftentimes, parents coming in, they're already coming in with a lot of guilt, potential embarrassment, or shame that they have been inadequate as parents when they bring somebody in for care. And so part of our job is to make sure to let them know that sometimes, we recognize that they're struggling, and it involves to also empower them. If they have their own mental health needs, it's to encourage them to get help. If there are certain pathological relationships that they have with their children, it's to kind of address that. And so it might mean for us to be able to recognize that there is something about that relationship that they have with their children that can be fixed, that can be changed. And it might have worked at different points. Families evolve. And so there are relationships that might function just fine at a certain point in time. And as young folks get older, that relationship needs to be adjusted. Expectations need to be adjusted. So it is working with the families to help them recognize that it's not necessarily that they're doing something wrong. It's not that there's a young person who is doing something wrong. It's not that any individual is pathological, but that there might need to be a different set of expectations as the family grows, just like the individual is growing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dubé. Really, really appreciate that. Professor Waldman, I wonder if you could jump in here and kind of share just some practices and protections for youth who come in contact with the justice system, and then also thinking about any advice we can provide to parents with children who have been arrested or incarcerated as well.
Sure. My first advice, always, regardless of the situation, surroundings, audience that I am talking to, that Fifth Amendment is real. You should not talk to the school resource officer. You should not give a statement. You should not talk once you get into the juvenile facility or jail if they are an older school-aged student, about anything that happened over the jail phone or the detention center phone, right? Do not make the police prove the case. Do not help them, right? And that includes student statements inside the school setting, whether it be to an SRO or an assistant principal or a principal or a staff member. The Fifth Amendment protections apply, right? The right to remain silent, regardless of the person who is asking that question, right? You might not always get read your Miranda rights, depending upon the situation, but you can always refuse to provide a statement. It is very rare that the statement that is provided by a student completely and totally exonerates them such that the system decides not to go forward with the case. So my first statement is advise your young people, do not speak, right? Blame a parent, blame me, I don't care, right? I was advised that I can't answer that question without my mom's permission. And then when they call mom, say no, right? Don't say, oh yeah, you can totally talk to my kid. Not the right thing to do. Once in the system, right? In almost every jurisdiction at this point, young people are automatically provided an attorney inside the system. That is not true in some jurisdictions. In some jurisdictions, they have the right to waive that attorney. Do not waive the right to an attorney, right? I did go to law school. We do know what we're doing. We are better equipped to navigate that system with you. It is never in your best interest to take on that system alone. But then from a more sort of practical situation of not your legal rights, but ways to actually advance through the system. If a young person is in the detention center, is detained during this process, family involvement is instrumental, right? It is probably the first time your son or daughter is away from home for any significant amount of time. They need to talk to their parents, right? Whether it be video conference, phone calls, in-person visits, family communication and family engagement is instrumental at this point. Inside the court system, the parent's word goes a very long way into what happens next. And so in almost every courtroom, as we're deciding whether the case should go forward, how the case should go forward, a judge, a prosecutor is going to ask the parent, tell me about how your child generally does, That's not the time to actually voice all of your little nitpicky concerns about the teenager in your life, right? There's the time to actually rally around your child, identify the supports you're willing to put in place, identify that there are supports that are in place, the mental health professionals you've already engaged or spoken to, and rally around the child in support at that stage.
And Professor Waldman, I actually want to give you a minute to just kind of big takeaway from this conversation tonight, and then we'll go through each panelist before I do some closing remarks.
So I guess my big takeaway is that we need to remember that we're dealing with children. And a lot of times, a lot of incidents, a lot of engagements that we see that lead to suspensions, expulsions, but more importantly, juvenile court involvement start with one of two things, right? One, normative adolescent behavior, stupid stuff that kids do, Instagram pranks that go wrong, school kids fighting, right? Boys fighting over girls, girls fighting over boys, right? Things like that happen in the school setting. And that's actually, I've just described half of my caseload right now, right? Those things happen every day and we don't need to criminalize it. The second type of case that comes out of a school system are power struggles, right? They're literally engaging in a power struggle with a young person. That's not going to end well for either side, but it's particularly not going to end well for the child. But we need to disengage from that moment and remember, right? They are children. They might be having a bad day too, and we should continue to treat them as children.
I was told when I worked at a detention facility not to pick up the rope, and that was the argument. As soon as you started the argument, you lost. You lost that game of tug of war. So that always really stuck with me. And that space, I think that was a really big conversation. So thank you for offering that up today. Dr. Vincent, do you want to jump in and offer some last minute thoughts?
Sure. So just want to, not that people need reminding, but remind people that this is an extraordinarily stressful year. And it has been one that has been hard for adults to manage because stressors have gone up and a lot of our coping mechanisms have been taken away. So just think about how hard it is for you as a fully formed adult with a fully functioning brain to navigate this and to put yourself in the shoes of a child. Like Professor Waldman said, no one is going to be at their best this year. That includes your students and it also includes you. So everybody needs more grace right now. And I would encourage people to be aware of the fact that they may be more easily angered, a little bit more irritable because of what we're all dealing with in our society. And so a piece of that is taking time out for yourself and taking a step back because you can't give your students what you yourself don't have, but also thinking about their responses in the context of not just their family, but what the larger society is going through too.
Yeah, I think that's so important, Dr. Vincent, touching on ourselves as adults and as leaders and as providers. We can't pour from that empty cup. Dr. Dubé, takeaways?
Well, I'd just like to echo what Dr. Vincent said, that self-care is very important. And it's also important to know that, you're not alone. And hopefully you're not trying to go alone. Everyone here obviously is here because they care about the young folks that they work with in whatever capacity. So it's important to remember that you have a team with you. And if you don't have that team, to try to build that coalition to help the young person in front of you. One of the most chilling moments for me a couple of years ago when I was in training, going to an advocacy event in Washington, D.C., we had Paul Begala, who was an advisor to President Clinton before that. And he had come and he had told us about how administrations would plan for prisons, what prison population that they're looking for. And he told us that what they did was they would go into elementary schools and they'd look at disruptive behaviors in elementary schools. And that's how they planned the number of prison beds that they would need, 30 years, 20 years down the line. As a child psychiatrist, that was a pretty chilling moment to hear that. And it's not something that I want to see. And I want to see preventative care. And so I want to thank the audience for being here and being part of the solution.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. There's data out there that shows where the support is needed and where we should be going. And yeah, I think it's on all of us to continue to push that needle forward. Um, I did want to highlight our resource that inspired this town hall. What do disruptive behaviors indicate? And encourage everyone to check it out, either on our website or by checking out the chat box. We should be putting it up there here shortly. Here are a couple of the statistics we wanted to share with you that we haven't shared already tonight. Students with disabilities represent 12% of the overall enrollment, but they are 28% of the students referred to law enforcement or arrested. And roughly 70% of students arrested or referred to law enforcement are Black or Latinx, far overrepresenting the prevalence in the general population. The most significant indicator predicting which children will be suspended is not the type of offense, but a combination of factors, including the color of their skin, their special education status, what school they go to, and whether they have been suspended before. You know, when we do notice these disruptive behaviors, we want to be able to respond appropriately. And we've talked a lot about some different things that staff members, individuals can do. You know, we've talked about space. But there's something that the APA Foundation has available for schools that are out there. We have the Notice Talk Act at School program. I'd invite you to check it out online. We do have our 2020 briefing report. And a part of what we are trying to address on top of kind of this 8 to 10 years that we know is a delay from the first signs and symptoms to connection to care is this school to prison pipeline that we've kind of been discussing here tonight. Is the fact that when students do show disruptive behaviors, they're more often met with that punishment. They're kicked out of school, and Professor Waldman said it here tonight, that decreases their ability to be successful. And with our program, we really try to train all staff members, and this isn't just teachers or administrators. These are coaches. This is janitors. This is the food workers. Anybody who is a member, an adult member of your school community in middle or high school. We train them in recognizing that disruptive behavior, noticing that disruptive behavior, and approaching it with empathy and compassion, starting a conversation to gather more information. You know, what we've heard tonight is figure out what's going on, right? What is that root cause? I don't know. I want to learn from you. And then once we do hear that they need supportive services, acting to connect them to those supportive services is crucial. You know, on the screen here, I just wanted to share our different ways that you connect with us. apafdn.org/schools is how you can find the material that we shared here tonight. Also some other free resources that we have available, both for school staff, but also for families, which is really exciting, and we want to encourage you to do that. Lastly, thank you so much, Dr. Dubé, Dr. Vincent, Professor Waldman, for your thoughtful answers and for spending time with us today. You know, I think as the APA Foundation, we want to continue to work towards a mentally healthy nation for all. And we want to thank you for all the great engagement and for joining us for this virtual town hall. What do disruptive behaviors indicate? Again, we are at time. We will be recording this and posting this. We should have it up by early next week. We will be emailing it out to everybody as well. Thank you again, and have a great evening.